What's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It is Kevin Forte, and today we are going to take a look at what went wrong for Pierre Dorion with the Ottawa Senators. His career with the Senators is officially done. There's been a lot of debate whether it was Pierre Dorion being fired or potentially resigning or whatever the case is. Pierre Dorion no longer the GM of the Senators, as Steve Staios will be stepping in as the next GM in Ottawa. But there's a lot to unpack here because, as much flack as Pierre Dorion's getting here, and I don't think this is the last noose to be crossed in Ottawa. There's a lot of debate about DJ Smith and potentially his future with the Senators, especially with the new ownership. But we obviously know the nail in the coffin. It was released last week what happened with Dadonov, the Dadonov trade and everything like that. But there is so much to unpack before that. I think a lot of people's memory is very short and they forget just how much has happened in the Dorion era. And it's pretty interesting. And that's kind of the reason I wanted to make today's video, because there's a lot to unpack here. And we're going to take a look at, kind of what led up to Pierre Dorion becoming the GM of the Senators. Ultimately, what led to his downfall. I think a lot of people forget that part of it. We're going to talk about today some of his biggest trades that he made, good, bad. We're going to take a look at all of that today. All right, so let's get right into it. So Pierre Dorion, going back to his start, he was a amateur of scouting for a lot of teams around the league. He was an amateur scout for the Canadiens, an amateur scout for the Rangers, and he became a chief amateur scout for the Senators, which eventually led to him becoming an assistant GM with Brian Murray, which kind of got him into the management side of the game. In April of 2016, Brian Murray announced that he would be stepping down as the Senators' general manager and that Dorion would be his successor. Murray remained with the team, though, as a senior advisor through the 2016-17 season, up until his unfortunate death in August of 2017. And this is a point that I really wanted to bring home to you guys, because losing Brian Murray was the downfall of Pierre Dorion before he even got really 2 feet off the ground. And as bad as that trade was, with the trades that Dorion had made, and we'll talk about some of them in a second, that happened before Brian Murray's death. But a lot of the real aftermath and the downfall of the Senators came because of the death of Brian Murray. Brian Murray was a great general manager in terms of his management, not only of the players and the fan base, but the ownership. His ability to deal with Eugene Melnyk really was his real contribution to this franchise. And he was able to keep Eugene Melnyk in pocket, to put it in a term that will probably work with most of you guys. Pierre Dorion didn't have that same pull or leverage or power with Eugene Melnyk. And when it came to contract negotiations, after Brian Murray's death, Pierre Dorion was not able to have the same leverage that Brian Murray did. And that ultimately led to a bunch of these trades we're going to talk about in a second. So let's talk about that now, and I really wanted to bring that point home, because Brian Murray, unfortunately, he has his very unfortunate passing, very just out of the blue, really was the death of Dorion before he was really even able to get 2 feet on the ground. I really wanted to preface that. And it's not a cope or a cop-out for Pierre Dorion's lack of effectiveness, but it's something that needed to be brought up. So now that we've brought that up, let's take a look at what trades really hampered Pierre Dorion and really were the catalyst of his downfall. So his first trade wasn't anything big. He traded for Logan Brown. That didn't end up working out. Mikey McLeod is still playing for the Devils, actually. So that was a bad trade in that sense. Chase on for Seeloff, nothing crazy. Then we start to see his first real big fuck up, for lack of a better word. So he trades in July of 2016 Derek Brassard and a 7th round pick going to the Senators in exchange for Mika Zibanejad and a 2nd round pick. Now, obviously, we know this trade really backfired on them in 2 different ways. That trade ended up going where Jonathan Berggren was selected with that pick, and he is a top 6 winger for the Red Wings right now. So the Rangers messed up in this deal too, trading that pick away. But still, they traded basically Mika Zibanejad and Jonathan Berggren, which I would expect that the Rangers are pretty happy with that deal, and the Senators, if they just didn't make any moves, would be better off with both Berggren and Zibanejad right now than Derek Brassard and Luc Lehay, who not only did they trade the better player in Zibanejad and Brassard 1-for-1, but they also traded a 2nd round pick for a 7th round pick. So that was just a bad management of value by Pierre Dorion. And obviously we know how Zibanejad is done with the Rangers today. He's their first-line center. And Derek Brassard has bounced around the NHL. He had 2 60-point seasons with the Rangers up until that trade in 2016 and never reached the 40-point mark any season after that in his career. And he has now hung up the skates and retired, I believe, since the making of this video. And we know Mika Zibanejad has had a pretty good career as well in that time. So that was the first real bad trade by Pierre Dorion. He traded for Tommy Wingels in 2017. That actually turned out to be a fairly good trade and became a guy that was kind of a good DNA player for this team. Burroughs for Dahlin at the time. He took a lot of heat for that trade because Dahlin was projected to potentially be a good middle 6, top 6 center maybe. That never materialized in Vancouver. And Burroughs had a good 1 or 2 seasons in Ottawa. That actually didn't turn out to be that terrible of a trade for them. They traded a 3rd round pick for Victor Stahlberg. Evan Barrett, who played at Ohio State, ended up going to the Blackhawks, that pick. So that never really turned into anything, but still, trading a 3rd round pick for Stahlberg did seem like a lot at the time as well. Then comes one of the first big trades. Again, the Zibanejad trade, and now in 2017, the second big whoops by Pierre Dorion, trying to get his team to make the playoffs. The Senators acquire Matt Duchene in a 3-team trade with the Predators and the Avalanche. The Predators didn't do too well in this deal either. They traded for Kyle Turris. But the Avalanche really started to make some moves here. And you have to remember the context of this deal. Matt Duchene was putting a lot of heat on Joe Sakic, who was the GM of the Avs at the time. He put a ton of heat on Joe Sakic to make a move. And it looked like something that, maybe Joe Sakic could lose a deal here. He had no leverage in this deal, but he was able to pull off one of the best trades in his era as GM of the Avalanche. So the Avalanche acquire Andrew Hammond, Shane Bowers, and a 1st round pick and a 3rd round pick from the Senators. They also acquired Vladislav Kamenev and Sammy Girard from the Nashville Predators. Andrew Hammond and Shane Bowers never really turned into much and never materialized much for the Colorado Avalanche. Vladislav Kamenev, who currently doesn't have an NHL contract and is currently playing with CSKA Moskva, he never really turned out to be that big of a loss. But we obviously know there were some other parts of this deal that really were a big factor. And Sammy Girard has been a top 4 defenseman with the Colorado Avalanche for the past few seasons. So Sammy Girard was pretty good. Philip Hallander, the Avalanche ended up trading that pick to the Penguins. And then, obviously, the biggest piece of this trade, they traded Matt Duchene for Bowen Byram, who Bowen Byram is going to be a good hockey player. He already is a very good defenseman. probably at the very least going to be a top 4 defenseman, has the potential to be a top pairing defenseman at the NHL level. That was a tough one for the Ottawa Senators. This was the second bad trade by Pierre Dorion, and one that would later really cost him a lot. We see another trade that actually turned out to be a good one. They traded Dion Phaneuf and Nate Thompson for Marian Gaborik and Nick Shore. This is obviously not the Gaborik from years prior, but Gaborik played pretty well for the Senators, and that actually didn't turn out to be that bad of a trade. You know, Pierre Dorion was known for making a lot of 3-team trades, and this is one that actually wasn't terrible for Dorion. He traded Derek Brassard and Tobias Lindbergh. Oh, no. He traded Derek Brassard and Vincent Dunn for Ian Cole, Philip Gustafson, a first and a third round pick. There was a lot of stuff going on in this deal. Obviously, Ryan Reeves was traded. Tobias Lindbergh was in this deal. And what's interesting is this is one of the deals where the Senators were acquiring a lot. If they had kept Gustafson, who they no longer have, and they ended up keeping Keandre Miller, again, those are two guys that the Senators could really use right now. And they traded both of them away. So even in a deal where Dorion, you might have, say, won that deal and could have really gotten something back for Brassard, he somehow ended up fumbling the bag later on. So at the time, that looks like a good trade. But then he makes more trades. Now, obviously, in 2018, a lot happened. We're hearing a lot of stuff about Erik Karlsson and Mike Hoffman. There was a fight between the wives and the girlfriends, and the WAGs getting involved now. So we know a lot of stuff was going on. And in June of 2018, Mike Hoffman gets sent to the Sharks for Mikhail Bodker, Julius Bergman, and a 6th round pick. That obviously was not good value for Mike Hoffman. Even at the time, a top 6 winger, that was a tough one. That was a tough pill to swallow for the Senators and their fans. But it wasn't the end of the world. But it definitely hurt a little bit. Now we see that trade that they got for the Derek Brassard deal. In some way, the Rangers get more from the Senators. So not only did they trade Mika Zibanejad and that draft pick to the Rangers, they also traded Keandre Miller to the Rangers. So the Rangers acquire the 2018 first-round pick, 22nd overall, for Keandre Miller. They ended up selecting Miller. The Senators ended up selecting Jacob Bernard-Docker and Jonathan Tchonik, which Jacob Bernard-Docker is still kind of an up-in-the-air player, kind of a fringe defenseman. And they traded Keandre Miller. So again, the Rangers going back into the bank, going to the Senators bank saying, listen, we'd like some value. And they were able to get that from the Senators once again. And another deal that really, really, really screwed up Pierre Dorion with the Senators. Now, this is obviously in the aftermath of the Hoffman-Karlsson situation. Karlsson was having a ton of problems in Ottawa, even after Hoffman left. And we kind of assumed that once they traded Hoffman that, well, now they just have to sign Erik Karlsson, right? Because now that, they were going to have to decide between Hoffman or Karlsson. And it looked like at the time that, well, trading Hoffman away, now that was it. They were going to keep Karlsson, and they had decided they were going to keep one of the two, and it looked like it would be Karlsson. Well, they ended up deciding to trade both. During training camp of 2018, Erik Karlsson and Francis Perron go to the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Dylan DeMello, Chris Tierney, Rudolph Balcers, Josh Norris, a 2020 first-round pick. We'll talk about that again in a second. A 2021 second-round pick. And a 2019 second-round pick. Now, obviously, a lot happened in this one. as they acquired Tim Stuchla. That ended up becoming a lottery pick, third overall for the San Jose Sharks. That ended up going to Ottawa. So Ottawa, it seemed like, had gotten revenge from trading their own first-round pick a year out, where they had traded Bowen Byram to the Avalanche. The Sharks had traded Tim Stuchla, basically, to the Ottawa Senators for Erik Karlsson. So obviously we know how things unfolded. The Sens received a first-round pick from the Sharks no later than 2022 if Karlsson is on an Eastern Conference roster. So obviously those conditions were not met. So they could have gotten another first-round pick. That didn't end up happening. They ended up receiving the 2019 pick, and then Ottawa received the Sharks' 2020 first because San Jose... So the Sharks didn't make the playoffs in 2019, so they figured, well, we'll be better next year. Well, they unfortunately made the wrong bet and ended up giving the Senators a top 3 pick. So they could have traded that 2019 pick, decided not to. They thought they would be better. That was a down year. Didn't end up being the case. Things only spiraled out of control after that. Obviously, we know how things have gone since then in San Jose. But this was a trade that, Josh Norris and Tim Stuchla, out of this whole brigade of players, ended up being pretty good players for the Senators. So it looked like a win, despite everything that happened, right? So we move up in time a little bit, and it seemed like Dorion was avoiding making the big mistake trades. Matt Duchene, we obviously know, didn't want to sign in Ottawa. They were kind of a fringe playoff team, and it looked like maybe they were able to save themselves again because they picked up Lassie Thompson and Yegor Chinikovic. Well, neither of those guys really worked out, and funny enough, Chinikovic ended up going to the Columbus Blue Jackets. So that deal really didn't end up mattering at the end of the day. So the Senators ended up making 2 trades with the Blue Jackets. Kind of odd because usually when you're trading with a team like that, you don't want to help them out more. But they did. They traded Ryan Dzingel for Anthony Duclair. Kind of a weird change of events in that one. Then we would see them make another trade that was pretty big on trade deadline day. On February 25th of 2019, the Ottawa Senators had now traded their 3 big players. They had traded Mark Stone, Erik Karlsson, and Mike Hoffman. And Mark Stone going to the Vegas Golden Knights with Tobias Lindberg. He got sent back to the Vegas Golden Knights after a couple years before making a trade that he was involved in. Oscar Lindberg would go the other way, so the Lindberghs getting traded back and forth for Eric Brandstrom and a 2020 second-round pick, which became Igor Sokolov, which is still TBD. To be determined what we're going to see from Sokolov, but to this point, not great results. Eric Brandstrom was the big piece of this trade. That was someone that Pierre Dorion really liked in this deal. He's currently with the Senators still, but you look at his numbers, they haven't been all that impressive. And it kind of leaves you wondering, he had 18 points last year, 14 points 2 seasons ago. Considering he has 0 points through 7 games this year with the Senators, what did they really get in that deal? And at this point, it doesn't really look like much. Again, another deal that just really didn't work out for the Ottawa Senators. And again, another trade to stack on top of the many that really didn't work out. Now we see the Senators bailing out the Leafs again. Connor Brown, Nikita Zaitsev, and Michael Carcone going to the Senators for Cody Ceci, Ben Harper, Aaron Lucic, and a 3rd-round pick, which became Alex Laferriere. Another trade where, again, the Senators kind of bailing out the Leafs. Cap issues. Nothing really materialized for a couple of years. We really didn't see much happen over the span of time. But then they would trade Vladislav Nemesnikov for a 4th-round pick. Nemesnikov has been real solid for the last couple of years. And even though he's in Winnipeg today, you look at his career since leaving Ottawa, he had 25 points in 54 games. He ended up putting up some pretty good numbers for a few seasons. And maybe not all of them with Colorado, but in Detroit, he played well. And this season, he has 3 points in 10 games, which is better than Eric Brandstrom. So, you know, you're kind of looking around the league and you're saying another deal that for a 4th round pick, looking back, they probably could have gotten a little bit more for Nemesnikov. Then we would see the next trade that, you know, really kind of was another fan favorite player leaving the organization. Jean-Gabriel Pageau going to the Islanders in 2020 for a 1st round pick, a 2nd round pick, and a 3rd round pick. Now, this ended up being maybe, again, another trade that hurt, but at least they were able to get some good value for it. So that 1st round pick ended up being the 28th overall selection, which you would think, well, that's probably not going to be a great player. Yeah, but Ridley Gregg was the player in that deal, and that ended up being a good move for the Senators. As you look at the current situation, this season he's got 16 points in 29 games through his NHL career. Those are some pretty good numbers for a guy that they traded in Jean-Gabriel Pageau, who is just a really solid 3rd-line center. That's a pretty good return. So that's one of the deals that's actually, as much as it sucked for the Senators at the time and fans were really upset to lose him, that was a big deal for them. They acquired Matt Murray for John Gruden and Joel Blomqvist. Didn't really matter. Wasn't a great trade or a bad trade, but it was a trade. They traded a 2nd round pick for Derek Stepan. He had a couple good seasons in Ottawa, but I think they'd like to take that one back. Josh Doan could be a really good player for the Coyotes, potentially as soon as next season. Taking a look further, just a couple of middle-of-the-pack trades. They were able to trade Goodbranson, but why did they get him in the first place? Another kind of tough trade. They traded Francesco Pinelli to the Kings for a 2nd and a 5th. I think they'd rather the prospect of Pinelli at this point. And then this is the one where we really saw things take off. So the Ottawa Senators acquired Nick Holden and a 3rd round pick for Evgeny Dadonov going to Vegas. And it's not necessarily the trade itself that really created everything that happened, but it's what happened later on that we're going to get to. This ended up being the nail in the coffin trade for Pierre Dorion's career. And looking at it at the time, it didn't seem like it. And even just, we're going to look at this in the future as like, that trade itself really wasn't that big of a deal. It's just what was involved, the little details that ended up being a huge factor. Travis Hamonic for a 3rd round pick. Really, he's been a good defenseman in Ottawa, so as much as I don't like the 3rd round pick, like, it's not the worst deal. They traded Matthew Joseph and a 4th round pick for Nick Paul. Nick Paul has been very good in Tampa Bay. I think they wish they could have gotten more for him, but Matthew Joseph has been a serviceable player, so it's not that big of a deal. They traded Alex DeBrincat. They brought in Alex DeBrincat for Kevin Korchinski, Paul Ludwinski, and a 3rd round pick. They'd probably rather Kevin Korchinski right now because now they don't even have DeBrincat. This was another really tough trade. They traded Philip Gustafson to Minnesota for Cam Talbot. Cam Talbot really hasn't been much. He's a backup right now in LA. And Philip Gustafson, the Gus Bus, has been solid and very serviceable for the Minnesota Wild and is their starting goaltender, at least at this point in time, and is projected to be their starter for the foreseeable future. A really big mistake there, once again, by Pierre Dorion. They had to trade out Jacob Chychrun. They traded Chychrun at last year's trade deadline for a 1st round pick, which became Dylan Boot, a 2nd round pick, which is conditional in 2024, and a conditional pick, a non-conditional pick in 2026 for the Ottawa Senators. So just another lack of foresight. Jacob Chychrun's been a good defenseman. That deal could end up being good if Daniil Boot becomes a good top 6 center. One of those interesting Russians that the Coyotes selected. But that could be another one where the Senators are trying to now build up. Instead of constantly trading players out, they're trying to bring players in. And it looked like a move that maybe the Senators were going into buying and trying to win position. And at around this time, too, remember, Eugene Melnyk had also passed away. And that might have given a little bit more of an opportunity for Melnyk or Pierre Dorion to sort of turn things around in Ottawa. Now, we know what they traded DeBrincat for, which ultimately was a huge price in Kevin Korchinski, but they did trade him back. They traded him again as he was not going to sign with the Senators this past spring. So in July of 2023, the Detroit Red Wings acquire Alex DeBrincat and his rights for Dominic Kubalik, Donovan Sebrango, a 2024 first-round pick, which is a conditional pick for next year, and a 2024 fourth-round pick. A lot of this trade will end up depending on what happens with the Red Wings. If the Red Wings make the playoffs, and if the Red Wings can, make the playoffs and go on a run, that might not be as valuable as of a pick. But we saw what happened last time around with J.G. Pageau, right? Like, if that pick ends up being decent, Dominic Kubalik is still with Ottawa and looks like a pretty good player, actually. But I think they're going to end up trading him before the deadline this year, so they need to get some good value for him. He needs to have a good season this year. Dominic Kubalik, and a lot of this is hinging on that first-round pick. If they can pull off another Ridley Gregg, mid to late first-round steal, the Ottawa Senators might fare in this deal. But we've obviously seen DeBrincat, at the making of this video, is one of the leaders for goals and points so far this NHL season. Again, another tough blow for Pierre Dorion. The inability, the Senators keep going for guys that don't have a ton of length on their contracts, right? We saw the Matt Duchene trade, the DeBrincat trades. They were trades that he made that guys that he brought in and wasn't able to sign. And when you bring in those types of players, you have to have the idea that you're going to re-sign them, and none of them were working out. And it really hurt Dorion in his career. So the combination of those deals, guys that he had drafted and developed, not being able to sign them, like Carlson and Hoffman and Stone, not being able to keep those guys, as well as making one-for-one trades that just didn't work out. And the obvious example of that being Derek Brassard for Mika Zibanejad. The combination of all of that, Eugene Melnyk, and, rest his soul, but his involvement in the organization didn't really help Eugene Melnyk and kind of made his job more difficult than it already needed to be. The Senators were really in a tough situation with Pierre Dorion, and I am going to give him that preface. But at the end of the day, you still have to find a way to execute. And at the end of the day, his resume resides on him and him alone. And as much of an impact as ownership and everything else around him may have played a factor, what ultimately ended up being his downfall with all of these weird trades and things like that, his ultimate downfall was the new ownership coming in, and within weeks of the new ownership group being named, the Eugene Melnyk's daughters had sold the organization, and it had come out that in the Evgeny Dadonov trade, which was back in a couple of years back, right? It was a while ago, that Dadonov trade. Going back to that Dadonov trade, a very important detail was left out. Yeah, in 2021. So 2 years, almost 3 years later, since this trade, Evgeny Dadonov for Holden and a third. Apparently the deal was, apparently the Golden Knights were on a 16-team no-trade list. And he had a no-movement clause, which the Golden Knights had not known about. And the Golden Knights were ill-informed when they tried to trade him to the Anaheim Ducks that he was not allowed to get traded. And there was a lot of, the Golden Knights were very upset with Ottawa in the fact that they did not tell them that Dadonov had a no movement clause. And the lack of communication from Dorion and his staff, his other assistants, ultimately led to the Senators now losing a first-round pick in 2024. Now, unless the new ownership now in Ottawa is able to somehow rescind that or maybe lessen that penalty, that is a huge blow for the Ottawa Senators organization. And it got to the point where, now that they have Steve Staios coming in, it led to the point of where the Senators said enough is enough. And they had decided that it was time to let go of Pierre Dorion. And that's where we are today. Pierre Dorion is no longer the GM of the Ottawa Senators. His overall standing with the organization really wasn't all that solid. His time with the Senators was a pretty long tenure, 7 years with Ottawa as a GM, even longer than that as an assistant. Like I said, dating back to 2007, he's been with the Senators organization, so almost 15 years with the organization in Ottawa. It was a day that November 1st will be remembered as the turning point for the Senators, as Steve Staios is now the GM there. But this was a huge situation, which unfortunately for Dorion costed him his job. But there was so much beyond the Dadonov situation, which we're talking about over the last couple of weeks. There was so much beyond that hasn't been mentioned. And I think it was something that needed to be brought up again because of the ineptitude in so many trades. And I didn't even really get into some of the massive contracts that Dorion had signed in his time that also really defined his time in Ottawa. The Dadonov trade was a huge one. The Carlson trade, the rebuild is done conversation. Now we're entering another zone. That was in 2021. The huge contracts he had dished out. Here are just a few examples. Jake Sanderson got an 8-year deal at $8.05 million. He signed that in September of this year. Tim Stutzla also in September of last year, an 8-year, $8.35 million deal. Josh Norris, an 8-year, $7.95 million deal in July of 2022. In October of 2021, Tkachuk and his family kind of doing a holdout, a 7-year, $8.2 million deal. Drake Batherson, a 6-year, $4.975 million deal. That was back in September of 2021. And then another big one, Thomas Chabot, an 8-year, $8 million deal that was signed in September during training camp of 2019. You go down the list of mistakes that Dorion had made and ultimately led to his downfall with the Senators. Between ownership, new and old, a massive F-up in the Dadonov trade, a couple of bad trades he had made, some weird drafting, as well as a couple of big contracts dished out to young players, led to the downfall of Pierre Dorion. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. What do you guys think of the Pierre Dorion era in Ottawa? Let me know your guys' thoughts down below. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you again next time.